What you are about to learn will shock you. We will talk about what people ate to survive in the Victorian era. We imagine the Victorian era as a time of steam engines, lavish dresses, and great inventions. We picture gentlemen in top hats and ladies drinking tea in elegant drawing rooms. But behind the glittering facade of the Industrial Revolution lay a very different reality for millions of people. This reality had nothing to do with the polished version of Dickens' novels. It smelled of coal smoke, dampness, and despair. In this reality, the main question of each day was not, "What do I want to eat?" but "Will I find anything to eat?" The struggle for survival turned cooking among the poorest segments of the population into a true art form. It was the art of creating food from nothing, of finding calories where there seemed to be none. Watch the video to the end to find out which dish, once considered food for the most desperate, can now be found on the menus of expensive restaurants. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of Victorian bakers. Bread was the absolute staple of the diet for the vast majority of the population. It was not just a supplement to dinner, but often dinner itself, breakfast and supper. The rich could afford snow-white fluffy bread made from sifted flour, which was a status symbol. The poor, on the other hand, had to make do with dark, dense, and heavy bread made from coarse flour with bran. The price of bread was so important that fluctuations in its price could cause serious unrest. But the main problem was not the difference in quality, but widespread adulteration. Anything and everything was mixed into the flour to make it cheaper. Chalk, gypsum, and even sawdust were common ingredients in loaves for the poor. This made the bread not only less nutritious, but also simply dangerous. However, buyers had no choice. They bought what they could afford, often without knowing what they were actually bringing home. Bakers caught engaging in such fraud were subject to severe punishment, but the temptation to make extra profit was too great. This practice was so widespread that it became one of the first targets for the nascent food quality control movements. Many bakers used alum, a chemical compound, to make bread made from old flour whiter and more appealing. This allowed them to sell a poor quality product at a higher price. The buyer thought they were getting good bread, but in reality, they were getting nothing but an illusion. This struggle for bread quality became one of the symbols of the era. It reflected the deep divide between the classes. The rich ate pure products, while the poor were forced to take risks just to satisfy their hunger. The authorities gradually introduced laws regulating the composition of bread. But real change was still a long way off. For decades, ordinary people continued to play this dangerous lottery. For many families, the only way to get quality bread was to bake it themselves. But this required an oven and access to cheap flour, which was a luxury. Most relied on street vendors and bakeries. Do you think such savings on food quality can be justified in a highly competitive environment? Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next investigations. Are you ready to learn the truth about the most important food of the era? If bread was the staple, then potatoes were the foundation of survival for millions. Cheap, filling, and easy to grow, they were a real lifesaver for poor families, especially in Ireland. Potatoes could be boiled, baked, fried, or mashed. They could be a side dish, a main course, or simply the only food for the whole day. Their versatility made them indispensable in a meager diet. A family could feed itself from a very small plot of land planted with potatoes. This allowed them to survive even in conditions of acute resource scarcity. Potatoes provided the calories needed to work in factories and fields. However, such total dependence on a single product was incredibly risky. When late blight came to Ireland in the 1840s and destroyed the potato crops, it led to catastrophic consequences. Millions of people lost their only source of food. In England, the situation was not as critical, but potatoes played a key role there as well. They were sold on every corner, and hot-baked potatoes were a popular street food. They provided warmth in cold weather and kept people feeling full for several hours. For many children, a baked potato was their only hot meal. It was a simple but vital food. It allowed them to hold out until evening, when the family gathered for a meager dinner. Cooks in wealthy homes also used potatoes, but in a completely different way. They used them to make elaborate side dishes soufflés, and casseroles. The product was the same, but the worlds in which it was eaten were completely different. Even potato peels were not thrown away. They could be fried or added to soups for thickness. In a poor household, nothing should go to waste. This era showed all the strengths and weaknesses of monoculture. Potatoes saved millions from starvation, but they also caused one of the greatest tragedies of the 19th century. Could a single product feed an entire nation? The answer was no, and this lesson was learned at a very high price. But what if I told you that even the poorest households had their own culinary tricks for turning scraps into food? Today, we're revealing a secret that people used to pay thousands for, free of charge. The streets of Victorian cities were one big food market. For millions of workers who didn't have the time or opportunity to cook at home, street vendors were the only way to eat during the day. The variety was astonishing. They sold everything from oysters and fried eels to meat pies and pea soup. The food was hot, cheap, and available on every corner. One of the most popular treats was penny pies. These were small pies with meat filling that cost only 1 penny. What exactly was inside the filling often remained a mystery, and buyers preferred not to ask too many questions. Merchants showed remarkable ingenuity in making their goods cheaper. They used the cheapest meat trimmings and offal. The main thing was to create the illusion of a hearty and tasty meal for minimal money. But this affordability had a downside: a complete lack of hygiene. Food was prepared in unsanitary conditions, and the water used to wash dishes was dirty. This made street food an extremely risky venture. The famous penny lick was a prime example. It was a serving of ice cream or chilled dessert served in a small glass cup. After one customer ate their serving, the cup was simply rinsed in a bucket of water and refilled for the next customer. This practice led to the rapid spread of various diseases. But for children from poor neighborhoods, it was the only cold treat available. The temptation was too great to think about the consequences. Another popular dish was boiled shellfish, which was sold from trays. It was served with vinegar and pepper. It was a cheap and protein-rich food, affordable even to the poorest. Street food vending was an unregulated and chaotic business. It fed the cities, but at the same time carried a constant threat. Every meal on the street was a small game of roulette. Nevertheless, this street food culture was an integral part of city life. It reflected the rhythm and energy of the industrial age. People worked hard and needed quick energy to continue their work. What if I showed you a time machine and we traveled to a soup kitchen? In conditions of mass poverty, charity played a huge role. Churches and private philanthropists organized free soup kitchens to feed the most desperate. The main dish in such soup kitchens was almost always soup. It was easy and cheap to prepare in large quantities. The recipe was simple: water, a few bones for stock, some vegetables, and grains for thickness. Such soup was often watery and not very nutritious. But for those who had not eaten hot food for several days, it was a real salvation. It warmed and filled the stomach, providing temporary relief. The lines at these soup kitchens could stretch for several blocks. People stood in the cold for hours to get a bowl of hot soup and a piece of bread. It was humiliating, but often it was the only chance to avoid going hungry. Some charities took a more thorough approach. They tried to make the soup as nutritious as possible by adding meat and beans. Their goal was not just to satisfy hunger, but to give people strength. These soup kitchens became a symbol of both compassion and the social crisis of the era. They showed that society was capable of helping its neighbors, but at the same time, they demonstrated that the system could not provide even the basic needs of its citizens. Newspapers often wrote about the work of these kitchens, urging wealthy citizens to donate money. For many wealthy people, this was a way to demonstrate their social responsibility. They felt that they were doing a good deed by helping the poor. For those who came for soup, it was a difficult experience. On the one hand, they were grateful for the food. On the other hand, they felt ashamed of their poverty and dependence on charity. These kitchens were especially busy in winter, when the cold and lack of work made the poor's situation even harder. Hot soup on a frosty day could be the difference between life and survival. Can you imagine a bowl of soup being the main goal of your whole day? This was the reality for many in the Victorian era. But even stale bread and watery soup were unavailable to those who ended up in workhouses. In the next chapter, you will learn what those at the bottom of society were fed. Workhouses were institutions for the poor who could not feed themselves. In exchange for shelter and food, they had to perform hard labor. Life there was subject to a strict schedule, and meals were no exception. The workhouse diet was designed to be as cheap as possible and just enough to survive. It was monotonous and tasteless. The goal was not to feed people, but only to keep them working. The basis of the diet was oatmeal, or grial. It was a thin porridge made with water, which was served for breakfast. It was gray, watery, and practically tasteless. Lunch usually consisted of bread and cheese. Portions were strictly measured. Sometimes on Sundays, they would give a little boiled meat with potatoes, which was considered a real treat. Dinner was as meager as breakfast. It could be bread and cheese again, or another serving of porridge. There was no variety. Food was fuel, not pleasure. The menu was calculated by calories by officials who had never tasted such food themselves. It was believed that such a diet would discourage people from going to the workhouse. Poverty was seen as a vice, not a misfortune. Meals were eaten in large, cold dining rooms in complete silence. Talking during meals was forbidden. The atmosphere was oppressive and reminiscent of a prison. The quality of the food was extremely poor. The bread was stale, the cheese was the cheapest available, and the meat, if any was served, was tough and stringy. They saved on everything. Such a diet was especially difficult for people who were used to different food. Many ended up in workhouses because of temporary difficulties. They were forced to get used to this joyless food. Despite its meagerness, the workhouse diet was guaranteed. For some who lived on the streets, it was better than nothing. It was harsh, but it was stability. Want to know the secret that warmed an entire nation? Tea in the Victorian era was more than just a drink. It was a social ritual, a source of comfort, and even a kind of currency. For the upper and middle classes, afternoon tea was a whole ceremony. It was served with fancy sandwiches, scones, and cakes. It was a time for social chit-chat and relaxation. But tea became a truly indispensable drink for the poor. It was more affordable than coffee and gave a feeling of warmth and energy. A hot, sweet cup of tea could perk you up after a hard day's work. Even the poorest families tried to buy at least a little of the cheapest tea. Often, tea leaves were brewed several times. The last brews had almost no color or taste, but it was still hot water. A lot of sugar was added to the tea to make it more caloric. It was a cheap way to get quick energy. Sometimes a little milk was added to the tea if they could afford it. Tea became an integral part of British identity. It was associated with home, comfort, and respite. In cold and damp dwellings, it was the only source of warmth. The quality of tea available to the poor was very low. Often it was not whole leaves, but tea dust and production waste. Sometimes dried leaves from other plants and even dyes were mixed into the tea. Despite this, the ritual of tea drinking was strictly observed. It was a small island of normality in the chaos of poverty. Over a cup of tea, the family could gather together and forget their problems for a few minutes. Workers took cold tea with them to the factories and thermoses. It helped them cope with thirst and fatigue during the long working day. What drink plays such an important role in your life today? Tea was a universal drink that united the entire nation, from the queen to the humble dock worker. But drinks were only a side issue to the main question: where to get meat when there was no money for it. Meat was a real luxury for most Victorians. A good piece of beef or lamb was only available to wealthy people. The poor could only afford what was left after the carcass had been cut up. So-called offal, or guts, formed the basis of the poor's meat diet. These were internal organs, heads, feet, and tails. Everything that the aristocracy considered inedible was a valuable source of protein for the poor. One of the most popular dishes was tripe, cleaned and boiled beef stomach. It was sold ready-made in markets. At home, it only needed to be heated up and served with onions and vinegar. Pig's trotters, or trotters, were also a cheap and popular food. They were boiled for a long time until the meat became very tender. It was a fatty but filling food, especially appreciated during the cold season. Hearts, kidneys, and livers were also used. They were stewed with vegetables and gravy to make hearty and inexpensive stews. A skilled cook could prepare a perfectly edible dish from the simplest ingredients. In London, aspic eels were particularly popular. Eels were caught in the Thames, boiled, and then covered with broth, which turned into jelly as it cooled. This dish is still considered a traditional London delicacy. Animal heads such as sheep's heads were not wasted either. They were boiled for a long time to make a rich broth, and the meat that could be cut from them was used in pies. This was the pinnacle of zero-waste consumption. Such food required long preparation. To make tough and specific-tasting offal edible, it had to be boiled or stewed for hours. This required time and fuel, which the poor often did not have. Therefore, many people bought ready-made dishes made from offal from street vendors. It was quick and convenient. The vendors knew how to cook these difficult ingredients deliciously. Today, many of these products, such as liver or kidneys, are considered delicacies and are served in restaurants. But in the Victorian era, it was not gourmet food, but a harsh necessity. It was survival food. When there was no money at all, people turned to what they could get for free. Gathering wild plants was an important source of sustenance for the rural and even urban poor. Forests, fields, and roadsides became sources of food. They gathered everything that was edible. Berries such as blackberries and elderberries were used to make jam and pies. They were a source of vitamins in a meager diet. Edible herbs such as nettles and sorrel were used to make soups and broths. Nettles, when properly cooked, were similar to spinach. They were a free and nutritious green. Mushrooms and nuts were also gathered. This required knowledge as it was easy to pick something inedible. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation. Even in cities, people managed to find food. They caught fish and crayfish in rivers and canals. Of course, the cleanliness of this water left much to be desired, but hunger made people forget about caution. Many working-class families tried to start a small vegetable garden or allotment. It was a small piece of land, often on the outskirts of the city, which they rented for a small fee. They grew vegetables for their own needs on it. Potatoes, cabbage, onions, carrots, anything that grew well and could be stored for a long time, were planted in these gardens. The harvest from such a plot could significantly improve a family's diet for the whole winter. Working in the garden was hard, but it gave a sense of independence. The vegetables grown were guaranteed to be fresh and of high quality. Unlike those sold at the market, they were not spoiled or adulterated. It was a reliable source of food. Gardening was not just a way to obtain food, but also an important part of working-class culture. It provided an opportunity to take a break from the noise of the factory and work in the fresh air. It was a respite from a difficult life. Thus, people used every opportunity to supplement their meager diet. They combined purchased products with what they could grow or find themselves. This ingenuity helped them survive. To understand the depth of the divide that separated society, one need only look at the tables of the rich. While the poor ate porridge and tripe, the aristocracy and the nouveau riche held feasts that were beyond imagination. Food for them was not just fuel, but a way to demonstrate their status and wealth. Lunch in a wealthy home could consist of 10 to 15 courses. They started with soups, followed by fish dishes, then several types of meat, game, and complex side dishes. It all ended with puddings, cakes, fresh fruit, and cheese. The portions were huge and the recipes were incredibly complex. Cooks competed in the art of creating edible sculptures and architectural compositions from food. The table had to look like a work of art. The menu featured the most exotic ingredients from all corners of the British Empire. Spices from India, turtles from the West Indies, pineapples from greenhouses. The world was open to those who had money. Meat was eaten in large quantities. A single dinner could feature beef, lamb, veal, duck, pheasant, and partridge. An abundance of meat on the table was considered the main sign of wealth. The presentation of the dishes was no less important than their taste. A whole roasted piglet or a peacock in feathers were common decorations on the table. This was intended to impress the guests. Such dinners lasted several hours. It was not just a matter of satisfying hunger, but a complex social ritual with its own rules and etiquette. Deals were made, political discussions were held, and destinies were decided at the table. The amount of food left over after such feasts was enormous. Some of it, of course, went to the servants, but much of it was simply thrown away. This contrast between excess and hunger was one of the most striking features of Victorian society. On the same street, there could be a house where whole piglets were thrown away, and a house where children rejoiced over a single potato. These were two different worlds that hardly ever intersected. Cookbooks of that time are full of recipes for complex and expensive dishes. They say nothing about what 90% of the population ate. The history of cooking, like any history, is most often written by the victors. Despite all the difficulties, it was during the Victorian era that the foundations of the modern food industry were laid. Technological progress and new inventions gradually changed the way people ate. These changes affected all levels of society. One of the greatest inventions was canning. The ability to preserve food in airtight tin cans was revolutionary. Canned meat, fish, and vegetables became available all year round. Canned food was a real lifesaver for the Army and Navy. But over time, it also found its way into everyday life. Middle-class families began to use them for convenience. And for the poor, it was a way to buy cheap protein. It was during this era that the first brands we still know today appeared. Companies like Cadbury began producing chocolate in bars, making it accessible not only to the aristocracy. Famous sauces such as Leah and Perrin's Worcestershire sauce appeared. The development of railways radically changed logistics. Fresh fish from coastal towns could now be delivered to London in a matter of hours. Fresh milk from villages became available to city dwellers. The first grocery store chains began to appear in cities. They offered fixed prices and higher quality goods than the markets. This was the beginning of modern retail. Technology also helped in the fight against counterfeiting. New chemical analysis methods made it possible to detect impurities in flour or milk. This gave the authorities the tools to control product quality. Of course, all these changes happened slowly. For a long time, new products and technologies were only available to wealthy people. But the trend had been set. By the end of the Victorian era, the average Briton's diet had become much more varied and safer than at the beginning. The Industrial Revolution, which had created so many problems, ultimately offered solutions to them. The world was on the threshold of the era of mass consumption. Thus, an era of contrast and struggle for survival paved the way for our modern abundance of food. Many of the habits and products that emerged at that time are still part of our lives today. We have taken a journey through the kitchens and streets of the Victorian era. We have seen how ingenuity and the will to live helped people survive in the most difficult conditions. Food at that time was not just a source of calories, but a reflection of social status, culture, and daily struggle. From adulterated bread and thin porridge to the exotic feasts of the aristocracy, the Victorian diet was a world of striking contrasts. Stories about tripe, jellied eels, and soup kitchens show us the other side of the glittering imperial era. They remind us of how far our society has come to achieve the food abundance that we take for granted today. And the very dishes that were once served to the poor are now served in restaurants. For example, tripe and aspic, which have become traditional delicacies. What surprised you the most about what we talked about today? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes.